stasera abbiamo il piacere di avere con noi Tudor, che è supervisore e didatta di analisi transazionale dell'approccio centrato sulla persona, professore di psicoterapia all'Università di Auckland in Nuova Zelanda e nel suo tour europeo sta seguendo la formazione in alcuni workshop di allievi e docenti di performance. Quindi siamo onorati di averlo con noi e abbiamo pensato di porgli alcune domande sul grande contributo teorico e metodologico che sta dando all'analisi transazionale, che osserva da una nuova prospettiva, una prospettiva che tu chiami co-creativa. Che cos'è l'analisi transazionale co-creativa?
Prima di tutto, grazie per la tua introduzione, è sempre un gran piacere di essere tra di voi, anche tra di noi. E adesso passo in inglese. For me, the co-creative transactional analysis is clearly the work not only of myself but also my work with Graham Summers, and indeed some of his own work, that describes a rereading of transactional analysis that emphasizes health psychology alongside what we know and the theories we have about psychopathology, and revisits Burns' original project of making things more simple. So I like returning to the roots. As you know, as you both know, I often start by quoting what Burns said about whether it's about ego states or games or whatever, but then looking for, in a sense, a new contemporary rereading of what Burns said, because most of what he wrote was now 50 years ago, and intellectually and in terms of research we've moved on. So I think there's a certain revisiting, but holding in mind his original project of making things more simple, explaining things with simplicity and clarity.
In questo tu hai lavorato molto per sviluppare una visione anche nuova.
Anche?
Nuova.
Ah, nuova, sì.
Mi colpiva la tua visione della T come necessariamente radicale. Altrimenti non è a T, dici, in un tuo lavoro. In che senso la T è radicale, deve essere radicale?
That's a great question. I guess for me, TA is or was radical. And I was particularly drawn to transactional analysis because of its radical psychiatry tradition, and I'm thinking particularly the work of Claude Steiner and his colleagues, particularly in Berkeley in the 1960s and 70s, because they had a social vision for transactional analysis, that TA would not only help change people particularly in terms of their internal oppression, but also help people change society. So I think a lot of their work, which is very much based in transactional analysis, is essentially about liberation from critical parent messages, liberation from negative scripts, liberation from isolation, liberation from the ways in which we get mystified. People say, oh, no, that wasn't abuse, it was love. And that's like a mystification of a problem. So I suppose that's the tradition that I align with, and I think that there are other aspects of TA that are radical. I think the original idea about cure which was a challenge to the more sort of long-term psychoanalytically minded therapy, where Byrne and, again, people like Steiner were saying, Byrne had this lovely metaphor: if somebody has a splinter in their hand, first of all you help pull out the splinter, then you might think about how come they tend to get splinters in their hand. So I think the idea about cure, I think the idea about bilateral agreements, contracts being bilateral agreements, is also quite radical. There's probably other things as well, but those are the first things that strike me.
Penso che tu fai una critica piuttosto esplicita alle psicologie che spingono al conformismo e quindi che vogliono adattare le persone togliendo i sintomi, considerando i sintomi come qualche cosa da togliere.
Yeah. Yes, I think I was very fortunate in my own upbringing to be encouraged to think for myself. There was a certain amount of conformity as well, but essentially I had a lot of positive messages, one might even say positive script messages, that it was possible to stand up for what you believed, to question authority, to question ideas, to develop ideas, and that was helped by my first degree in philosophy and theology, which is a training in critical thinking, essentially. So I don't have much fear of being critical, and even though I've been criticised for being critical, you know that some of the reactions to some of my work within TA, and they've been quite hurtful in some respects. But I think my passion for theory and for developing theory and for encouraging other people to develop theory keeps me going. So to me, theory, what you said earlier and about Karl Popper's ideas about theory being verified through falsifiability, any theory needs to stand up to being investigated. And I think that we all have theory, whether in a sense whether we know it or not. We all have a philosophical base. Also, students have theories that they come with, and clients have theories. So we have, I'm using theory quite broadly now, but I think we all carry an idea of how we understand life. And for me, that's, in the English phrase, up for grabs. It's something that we can play with, and that maybe that's also part of the co-creativity, the playfulness to say, let's think about this differently. Let's why are there 3 ego states? Maybe there's only 2. That, you know, because it tests the theory, and I know you like that.
Questo come aiuta il tuo modo di essere un didatta e un supervisore? Quindi quando c'è una costruzione non solo insieme ma anche in funzione dell'aiutare qualcuno che poi no, è il cliente o il paziente, come questo approccio può essere funzionale a far crescere, no, supervisori e terapeuti sì, più competenti dal tuo punto di vista?
Well, I think that links to something we talked about earlier in the conference, that essentially, I suppose, starting off with training, first of all, I see training essentially as educating, and I tend to use the word educating because that has more meaning in terms of the original Latin that we're trying to draw out of people what they already know and add to it, rather than coming from a deficit model where we assume that students don't know things. So that the first point is in a sense, bringing a health psychology to education and an education a view of education to training. So in some ways, I think we've got the wrong word. I think we should be using education rather than training. We've also, I think, have to discuss the word supervision, because for some people, supervision is seen as something that almost managerial, that you control, rather than having this sense of the wider vision. The sense that as a supervisor I can be alongside somebody and offer something that supports their thinking or their vision, but maybe challenges as well, but that adds to it. Now, I think behind your question, or in your question, is, and again I'm linking it back to the conference, that is actually quite radical, because we are trying to grow the strength of the individual rather than tell them what they don't know. We starting from a point of A, what they do know, and B, how can we add to what they know, and maybe then say, yeah, maybe some of what you know or you think you know doesn't quite work, or maybe needs to be challenged. So I would do that certainly in a training, education setting, certainly in supervision, and in a sense sometimes, or to bring that philosophy to the client work, because part of what clients are bringing is the negative impact of negative scripting. And so, of course, we're saying, well, you know, we want to build on your strengths, but we also then look at where things have become too fixed or stuck, or limiting. I like Bill Cornell's definition of scripts, in which I'm paraphrasing, but essentially he says scripts are always self-defining, but they're only sometimes self-limiting. So we look at, you know, what's the limitation. And so I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I've answered it in some way.
Tu hai arricchito l'analisi transazionale grazie anche alla tua conoscenza dell'approccio centrato sulla persona.
Yes.
E in particolare hai dato un grande contributo alla metodologia del dialogo attraverso i tuoi studi e le tue osservazioni sull'empatia.
Yes.
Ci puoi dire qualcosa?
Yes, I think that empathy and creativity, if you like, a certain playfulness, are the principal methods of co-creative TA. And that's why I very much like your invitation to talk about empathy and creativity and co-creativity. Essentially, my starting point is that we are born and hardwired to be empathic. We absolutely need the empathy, initially usually of a mother, to grow. We also know, interestingly, that the baby can regulate the mother, so in some ways has to develop empathy in terms of regulating the mother. And so I think that, if you like, the therapeutic project, or the co-creative therapeutic project, is to encourage the development of an empathy that's already there. For the most part, there are certain conditions, certain if you like, pathologies or conditions that I think block or damage our ability to be empathic. But mostly, I think, you know, we know from neuroscience that we can develop neural pathways by which we can grow and understand ourselves and others more. But I also think there's another pass, as it were, because I think quite a lot of therapy stops at the point of helping the person to be more themselves. But for me, this is still too individually focused. So I'm interested in helping the client, first of all, perhaps to receive my empathy, then to feel empathy for themselves, and then to feel more empathy for others. Because that way, I think, it brings me back to the point I made earlier about the social impact of transactional analysis. Rather than stopping at the point where somebody is a more actualized but selfish person, because I'm interested in the broader picture as well of, and some of the debates and ideas that are coming out about the idea of the empathic society. I think it's clear that in Italy, in New Zealand, in all over the world, we need more empathic society. We need more politicians who know how to spell empathy, know how to do it. They need to be more informed, I think, about neuroscience. We need ministers of health who are more cognizant about these things. So essentially the empathic and creative project is to help people bring out what is, and for the most part is, our natural qualities.
Su questo volevo chiederti un aspetto importante di cui oggi anche noi in Italia viviamo il bisogno, no? Che è quello di un approccio empatico nei confronti di una esperienza di integrazione multiculturale che sta diventando un'emergenza con la tematica della migrazione che viviamo con tanti conflitti anche ideologici, politici, sociali. Ecco, come l'analisi transazionale, un approccio empatico può facilitare un progetto di integrazione, di accoglienza di persone che vengono da mondi per noi italiani veramente sconosciuti, diversi.
That's a great question. I've thought a lot about this because I, as you both know, I was for quite a long time a political activist, and in the UK I would support a slogan of no immigration control because of the history of Great Britain and the United Kingdom being a colonial power. And so Britain would go to other countries and say, oh, you're part of the British family or Commonwealth and so on, and also colonize those countries. So I think that politically I would say certain countries like Britain have a historical responsibility for welcoming people that they gave passports to. But I think we've now got such a complex world where and there's so much movement of people, and people, for instance, in some countries where they're feeling very oppressed, they can obviously see countries like Italy and Britain as being more liberal, and they want to come. And so we now have a situation, or you have a situation in Europe, because I'm now in New Zealand, where I think that if you like, the indigenous people of Europe, the Italians, the British, whatever, perhaps feel more invaded. They don't feel in charge of their own destiny. And we know from TA the importance of human destiny and decisions and redecisions. So one of the things that I think is that people who I might years ago have called racist, so, oh, you're racist, I have a little bit more understanding, or put it this way, I think I'm more interested these days in getting alongside them and understanding what their fears are. Because I think what doesn't work is simply to accept people who come with very little attachment to, for instance, Italy, or to learning Italian, to staying in their own communities for maybe for protection, but we actually create a situation where there's more racism survives or thrives. So I think we can take a historical perspective or a social perspective about the responsibility for accepting certain numbers of immigrants. I think we also have to do something politically about the countries they come from. Because it's not possible simply to empty one country into another country. and we also have to make, I think we have to help immigrants make connection and, you know, learn Italian, for instance. But we also have to understand the fear and the sense that people who we might call racist have. And so I think that is an interesting project. And I've got a number of examples of where people have talked about that. And I have felt more, if I can let go of my judgment, I can feel more empathy for their position. And I think if they feel more empathised with, they're more likely to be open to receiving a neighbour who's different. What I worry about, particularly, and it's interesting from a distance now, but with the vote for the Great Britain to United Kingdom to go out of Europe, I've heard a number of stories from colleagues who said things like the day after that vote, their neighbour said, "You can go home," and so it's those sort of things that I think we are co-creating, and that's politically, socially dangerous. But essentially, I think in terms of linking empathy, I think if we can get more politicians in therapy, or to be supervised, yes, or have consultants who are therapists, and to be thinking more about empathy, if we can more than blame people or call people, you know, racist, that we can say, well, what is it that they're saying, and what is it that we need to hear? And thirdly, I would say, as far as the immigrants are concerned, to help them integrate into actually a society, and to be to bring something to that society, as many immigrants do.
E proprio su questo ti chiedo se puoi dirci qualche parola sul tuo concetto di adulto integrante, che ha modificato in senso di apertura, di rivisitazione l'idea degli stati di Dio.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I go back to Bern, and I read, and this came out of a challenge from my good friend and colleague Claude Steiner many years ago, because I said Bern talked about the integrated adult and so on, and so I reread Transactional Analysis and Psychotherapy, and found this, or reclaimed this notion or concept that basically of the neo-psyche, the part of our psyche that is new and constantly new and ever-changing and ever-growing, and that is relevant to the here and now. And for me, that's the integrating adult. I call it the integrating adult, or Graham and I call it the integrating adult, slightly different from Erskine's idea about the integrated adult, because the integrated adult sounds to me too fixed. It sounds like, you know, tutto a posto, finished. So the integrating adult has this idea that we are in a constant, as beings, as organisms, as social organisms, we are in a constant state of flow and development, at best. So the difference for me is that the integrating adult represents still a 3 ego state model of personality, but essentially a 1 ego state model of health, whereas the traditional and the more common model within TA, and I'm talking structural model, is a 3 ego state model of personality and a 3 ego state model of health, where we are trying to grow the parent or grow the child. For me, I'm more focused on the idea of helping a person to integrate more themselves and to, if you like, expand their adult, and essentially not to have archaic child or interjected parent ego states. Of course, that's an ideal. The reality is that we still have unresolved trauma or critical parent messages that we'll probably always have. I remember my first therapist said, after about 6 weeks of therapy, he said, "Oh, I think you've got 3 issues that we can work on." And I said, "Oh, great." And then he said, "And you'll probably be working on them the rest of your life." So, but there is a sense in which we resolve a lot, but sometimes when we're under pressure or under stress that we do those 3 issues or however many issues we have. So, yeah, I propose that we have an integrating adult, and that the way forward is to, through empathic transactions, through co-creating an empathic relationship where the person feels understood, that they themselves can resolve a lot of their issues.
Sì, quindi è una filosofia che diventa anche un metodo di colloquio,
Yes.
un metodo di gruppo.
Yes, absolutely.
Come si pone questa ricerca dell'integrazione continua nei confronti di persone che portano un disagio di disintegrazione dell'io? Quindi penso alle patologie marginali, no, narcisistiche, se vogliamo dare il termine patologia. Come quindi l'approccio del terapeuta integrante può rispondere ed essere in relazione con chi porta un sé disintegrato?
Again, I think it's a good question, because one of the criticisms, I think, of co-creative TA is that it's too much focused on health, and maybe some people forget the illness or the dis-ease. But I think with people who have severe trauma or severe interruptions and so on, I would still start with health. I was very struck by a colleague in the person-centered world who works in a hospital, and where people are, the particular patient he was talking about was catatonic. And the nurses were very worried because he was lying on the ground, and they were worried about him. And my friend Dion van Verde, who's a Belgian psychologist, said, "Oh, did he watch the football last night? Oh yeah. Did he get to bed? Yeah. Did he get himself up? Yes. Did he dress himself? Did he have breakfast? Yeah. Okay. So what's the concern? Well, he's lying in the middle of the hospital corridor. Is there a cushion, a pillow under his head? Oh no. Well, maybe put a cushion under his head." So all of this, to me, is focusing also, or first, on the health and the integration that we do, even if we are badly damaged. We still get up in the morning. Most people. I know some people don't. But so it was in a very subtle way, it was saying, let's support the health or the integration rather than disintegration. I read somewhere, I think it was somebody talking about Alfred North Whitehead's work on the organism. The miracle is that we hang together. The miracle of life is that we actually hang together as a whole being. That said, I think if we do that, then we can address did you say sort of the disage or the difficulties? But essentially, to be helping the person themselves draw on their own health in relation to their ill health. So the dialogue is not so much me as the therapist saying helpful or insightful things, but is helping them address their relationship with their illness. Even for some people, helping them to acknowledge their illness rather than thinking they're not ill. So obviously without a particular, I can think about generalized, I am thinking about specific examples, but I'm also thinking generally. But I think to me that's the issue, that most people have quite a lot of integrating adults. Some people maybe have less, but I don't think I've ever come across anybody who doesn't have any adult. And for that reason, I don't tend to use the theory about exclusions, because to me it's a rather naive theory. Because even somebody who's catatonic, who's schizophrenic, who's a drug addict, is using quite a lot of integrating adult. So that's, but I think what you're drawing out, which I think is helpful, is that what I would say is that my focus of work in those situations is to help the person themselves have the dialogue between their integrating adult and the introjected or archaic stuck places.
Una posizione che guarda al benessere più che alla malattia.
Yes, but also develops a dialogue, an internal dialogue between the benessere and the malattia. You know.
Grazie professor Tudor, ti ringraziamo per questo grande contributo che ci hai dato e capiamo che avremo modo di leggere ancora i tuoi scritti e di incontrarti di nuovo.
Sicuramente, in Italia.
Sì. No, non vuol dire che è niente, perché non è niente, ma è un gran piacere sempre di ritrovarmi con voi e speriamo ci vediamo subito anche, forse vicino diciamo. Grazie.